Didn't we just say goodbye to the super jumbos? Just a few years ago, Boeing and Airbus stopped making 747s and A380s, with many airlines before and since then retiring them in their droves, and some commentators dismissing them as relics of a bygone era. So why are some of the world's biggest airlines now pressuring Boeing and Airbus into building flying giants again? Well, it's not just nostalgia or a love for these big aircraft. It's a fascinating mix of technology, economics and timing. So today we'll see how super jumbos went from must-haves to the brink of extinction and now possibly back again. But first, let's explain what we mean when we say super jumbo. Originally, the term jumbo described the world's first wide-bodies, like the original Boeing 747, the McDonnell Douglas DC-10 and the Lockheed L-1011, the big jets that made the long-haul travel possible for the masses, especially after the deregulation of air travel. Now, the 747 was the clear winner among those early wide-bodies, but while that plane evolved from the 747-100 to the 400, it didn't actually grow much in terms of passenger capacity. But then came the super jumbo, a kind of arbitrary term meaning a plane bigger than the roughly 400-seat 747s. So it mainly refers to the Airbus A350 or the stretch 747-8. There were some more studies for super jumbos, like the McDonnell Douglas MD-12 in the 1990s, and Boeing previously studied some even more radical stretch variants of the 747. However, the A380 and the 747-8 were the only super jumbos to enter service, and now both of them are out of production. Why? Well, a quick analysis is because they were too big, but there's quite a bit more to it than that. Basically, the key factor here is that both the 747 and the A380 are four-engined aircraft, and the economics of four-engine jets often make them difficult to keep operating profitably all year round. Initially, regulators demanded that airliners flying over oceans and away from diversion airports must have 3 or 4 engines for safety reasons. But gradually, as jet engine reliability improved, ETOPS, or Extended Twin Engine Operation Performance Standards, allowed twin engine jets to fly such routes without problems and much more efficiently than the four engine jets. It did take some time for ETOPS to gain hold, but by the 1990s, planes like Boeing's then new 777 took full advantage of these new rules and started to dominate the market. However, Airbus was a bit slow in getting the message, which is how the A380 came to be, as we've explained in a previous video. The A380 got some orders, but nothing stellar, no US airline flew it for example, and gradually, with even more efficient twin-engine jets like the 787 and the A350 entering service, many of the A380 operators started to retire it. And they did it so quickly that some jets went to the boneyard when they were less than a decade old. But as I'm sure many of you know, not all airlines felt this way, with Emirates in particular being a particularly big fan of the A380. One reason why other carriers swapped the 747s and A380s for smaller jets, like the 787, is because this swap to a slightly smaller but efficient plane meant that they could offer more frequent long-haul services, since having flexibility in the time of day that the flight departs or arrives can be quite important, particularly for business travellers or for those who need flexibility when dealing with connecting flights. However, Emirates absolutely needs big jets like the 380 because they operate out of a single giant hub, Dubai International. And even though this airport is sized and configured perfectly for their needs, it can only fit so many jets. Now, Dubai will eventually replace this airport with an even bigger one. However, even so, the operating model of Emirates will still depend on giants like the A380. And that's why Emirates and its president, Sir Tim Clark, previously tried to convince Airbus to make an A380 with newer engines called the A380neo. Later still, Emirates pressured Airbus into a proper A380 replacement, using newer engines plus modern composites and other enhancements. Now that plan maybe isn't as crazy as it might first sound, because there were other factors that were working against the original A380 that made it less efficient than ideal, like the fact that its wing, its tail and even its landing gear were all sized for an even bigger A380 variant that was never built. So in theory at least, an A380 with newer engines, a slightly smaller and lighter wing, tail and landing gear could have 20 to 25% better efficiency than the current aircraft, according to Tim Clark, and Emirates wanted it badly. However, Airbus's response to this was, well, if you give us 20 billion euros, we'll do it for you. And while Emirates has some pretty deep pockets, they weren't prepared to go that deep. Realistically, with the A380 out of production since 2021 and its old assembly line now long gone and actually repurposed to make more A320neos, any thoughts of a newer A380 variant are unfortunately out of the question. Unless, of course, somebody else decides to pay that 20 billion price tag. Now, to be clear here, there are other airlines that still have use for the A380s, but just not to the scale of Emirates. Today, the second and third biggest A380 operators in the world are British Airways and Singapore Airlines with 12 each. Then there's Qantas with 10, Etihad with 9, and Lufthansa and Qatar with 8. And Emirates, well, they've got 116 of them. And with numbers like that, I think you can see why Emirates is so central to the A380's success, or to the success of other very large airliners. Speaking of which, if no other A380s are over the horizon, what other options are there for Emirates if they are to sustain their operating model of a single airport hub and a fleet of super jumbos? Well, if you think that at least some of what I've been talking about sounds a bit familiar, it's probably because we recently made a video about the Boeing's 777X and how the biggest variant, the 777-9, could follow up on the best-selling 777-300ER. Now, we've made many videos talking about the delays that have plagued the 777X program, but with Boeing's recovery looking more promising lately, the worst of those delays seem to be behind them. And in the process, this new aircraft looks set to become another Emirates favourite, which isn't surprising because now that the A380 and the 747 are gone, the 777-9 is the biggest alternative. Sure enough, out of around 473 total firm orders for the 777X family, Emirates has ordered 270 jets. That's after ordering 65 of them during the Dubai Air Show this year. But as I'm sure many of you already know, that's not all we heard from Emirates and Boeing with regard to this order. Emirates also announced that with this order, the airline also provides strong backing for Boeing's feasibility study to develop the 777-10, a larger variant of its 777X family. And the aviation world barely got a few hours to digest this news before Airbus announced that they're also studying a larger variant of their A350 that could be called the A350-2000. So what's going on? Well, the still not certified 777-8 and 9 don't have any orders from airlines in the United States, like the Airbus A380 never did. So can a 777-10 or an Airbus A350-2000 be successful? And can Boeing and Airbus actually produce and certify these jets? Well, I'll tell you after this. In the cockpit, efficiency is critical. Modern aircraft rely on a vast array of integrated systems where every single system earns its place and unnecessary redundancy is quickly removed. Somehow, when managing our own work, we tolerate the opposite. Tools that just don't talk to each other, data entered multiple times, and subscriptions piling up for overlapping features. And that's why we use today's sponsor, Odoo, to manage everything behind the channel. It's an all-in-one business platform covering everything from sales and finance to HR and project management. It really has transformed the way we manage the business side of the channel, and it's made us more productive and freed up time that I can now spend creating the best aviation content possible for you. And what I think you'll really like is how intuitive their website builder is. Their configurator walks you through 4 simple steps. First, choose your site type and your goals. Then pick a color palette or upload your logo. And now you can select the pages and features you want before finishing off by selecting a theme. From there, everything is customizable with drag and drop editing, images, colors, text, even animations, all without needing any coding experience. Your first app is free for life, including hosting and support, and you even get a free custom domain for the first year. And Odoo goes far beyond websites, offering a suite of 45 business apps available through one affordable solution. Scan this QR code or follow the link in the description below to give it a try. Thanks Odoo for supporting the channel. Now, let's get back to the story. Now, let's take a closer look at the two newly proposed widebodies, the 777-10 and the A350-2000, but starting with Boeing. Now, first of all, I think one detail about the 777-10 that's worth emphasising here is the fact that while Emirates were very quick to mention the new variant in their press release, Boeing's own press release doesn't mention the 777-10 at all. So, to be clear, Boeing didn't actually commit to developing the 777-10 variant, only that they would conduct a feasibility study on the aircraft. And from their side, Emirates said that they have the option to convert existing orders for the 777-9 to the 777-10 or the smaller 777-8. But they didn't commit to place a separate order for the 777-10 if and when Boeing greenlight the project. Now, if you think all of this is a bit premature, given that the 777-8 and 9 aren't even certified yet, you're not the only one. Boeing themselves seem to adopt a very reserved stance towards the 777-10 when the world's press confronted them about it at the Dubai Air Show. John Ostrower of the Air Current, who you should definitely check out if you haven't already, quoted a Boeing spokesperson who said, "We're always listening to our customers." But they also said that right now, Boeing's main focus is completing certification on the 777-9. And that stance makes perfect sense, since a few weeks before that Dubai Air Show, it wasn't clear if Boeing would even fly one of these test aircraft there, since the plane's participation in the show could slow down its certification process with the FAA. So, compared to the 777-9, the 777-10 would be around 16 feet or 4.9 meters longer, which means they will have seats for around 50 more passengers. The plane's total length will be around 268 feet or 81.7 meters, and Boeing would need to add a couple of extra emergency exits to increase its exit limit beyond the 440 seats of the 777-9. But as John Ostrower points out, Boeing already offers such a pair of extra doors as an option on the 777-9, and its flight test planes already have them. So it should be fairly straightforward to make these doors standard in the bigger 777-10. Another engineering challenge in creating the bigger variant is the engines. And here is where Boeing is probably a bit lucky. The 777X family uses the General Electric GE9X, and when it enters service, this will be the largest diameter operating jet engine in the world. These engines had their own teething issues in the 777X test program, but the good news for Boeing is that GE9X is a bit more powerful than what the 777-9 actually needs. In fact, the Emirates president pointed out that Boeing plans to increase the maximum takeoff weight of the 777-9 soon after it enters service, thanks to that extra power from the engine. All of this means that the GE9X should have adequate power for the longer and heavier version of the 777X. And in previous decades, the lack of large powerful engines like these was a big reason why planes like the A380 and 747 couldn't simply be redesigned to run on two engines, as we've explained in an older video. But when it comes to engines, there's another important consideration beyond raw thrust. According to the Aviation Week, one of the key factors that could decide if launching the 777-10 would be realistically possible is something called takeoff performance. So what does that exactly mean? Well, all aircraft need to have the ability to safely take off should an engine fail at the most critical point of the takeoff roll, right at V1. This is the absolute minimum airspeed at which the aircraft can continue accelerating to its rotation speed and then on to its subsequent single engine climb speed, known as V2, within the remaining runway and reach a minimum height above the runway end, known as a screen height, before the crew complete their checklist and bring the aircraft back in for a safe landing. And this obviously means that the aircraft will need to be fully controllable with a failed engine, whilst the other engine is potentially producing maximum thrust. To achieve this, the pilots will need to apply enough rudder and a sufficient airspeed to overcome the huge yawing force produced by the live engine to keep the aircraft flying straight, even at the maximum takeoff weight. And to ensure this is a calculation that we make before every single takeoff to ensure that we can climb away safely even if the engine fails at the worst possible time. And the ability of the aircraft to do that is going to be a big part of what Boeing's feasibility study on the 777-10 will figure out, along with the rest of the costs of developing and certifying this version of the aircraft, and the priority that such a version will have when compared to the other 777X variants, the 777-8F freighter, and the smaller 777-8 passenger variant. So that's the 777-10. Not quite as big as the A380, and we don't yet know if Boeing would be able to fit showers to the first class cabins like Airbus did with the A380. Even so, the plane could be the most realistic shot that Emirates has in replacing the Airbus Super Jumbo in the next couple of decades. But what about the Airbus A350-2000? Could the stretched A350 compete with the bigger Boeing variant? Well, the quick answer is probably not. So let's see why. Like the stretched Boeing, the Airbus has additional fuselage plugs. Basically extra slices of fuselage forward and aft of the wing to add around 40 more seats compared to the existing A350-1000. Again, additional doors would be needed to make an evacuation safe for the plane's higher passenger count, and Airbus could introduce other tweaks in the airframe to allow the design to handle the additional weight without problems. Unlike Boeing though, and its 777X, Airbus have hundreds of A350s already in service, and, as they like to point out, they've been learning how to squeeze more performance out of the design. A stretch like the A350-2000 is something they've looked at in the past, and with their growing experience, the prospects of making the plane happen look reasonable. However, one complication that the A350-2000 has that Boeing's 777-10 wouldn't have is the engines. The existing A350-1000 is flying with Rolls-Royce Trent XWB-97 engines with 97, meaning 97,000 pounds of thrust. And the problem here is that this particular engine variant has had some issues. In most of the world's environments, the engine is running just fine, despite some early teething issues affecting its service intervals, which isn't really unusual for a new engine. However, put those engines into hot and sandy environments like, say, the Gulf region, and these engines can suffer durability problems. And that's why to this day, Emirates has not placed any orders for the A350-1000, despite having plenty of orders for the smaller A350-900, which uses a less powerful version of the Trent XWB engine, which is less susceptible to the problem. Now, to be clear, Rolls-Royce have been making good progress in getting over these longevity issues, and because of that, many observers expected to see Emirates ordering the A350-1000 at the Dubai Air Show last November. However, that didn't happen. The point here is that if Airbus goes ahead with the stretch A350-2000, Rolls-Royce would need to figure out how to squeeze a bit more power out of that XWB-97 engine in a reliable way. Alternatively, Airbus would need to make the A350-2000 work with the existing engine despite the heavier fuselage and the 40 or so more passengers. That might be possible, but it would definitely limit the plane's range, as Airbus admits. However, this wouldn't be a problem for many potential operators. Of course, the other option would be to develop a completely new engine for the A350-2000. Rolls-Royce is working on its Ultrafan, which is a radical step over the existing Trent family of wide-body turbofans, with a geared fan at the front and advanced materials elsewhere. However, adding another engine to the A350 family, which already has two distinct engines for two A350 passenger variants and a freighter, that would be a bit complicated and expensive, to put it mildly. It would also take years to do and would require structural changes to the aircraft. And that's because Ultrafans have more weight towards the fan at the front, and so the A350's wing would need to be moved forward. Now, this might sound simple, but would actually require a huge amount of re-engineering and investment. Now, such a project might actually be a bit more realistic in the longer term though, if Airbus decides to re-engine the entire A350 family with Ultrafan engines to make all variants even more competitive. But even if they do, the A350-2000 runs into another problem. It just simply isn't big enough, for Emirates at least. The current A350-1000 is exactly the right size to be a one-for-one replacement for a Boeing 777-300ER, Boeing's most successful variant of the legacy 777. So the larger A350-2000 would be about the same size in passenger count as the Boeing 777-9, the first 777X variant that will get certified. But crucially, Airbus claim to have received plenty of interest for a stretched A350 from other airlines besides Emirates, and this is where things start to get interesting. Originally, Airbus didn't go ahead with the A350-2000 because they decided that the market for planes the size of the Boeing 777-9 wouldn't be big enough to support two competitors. However, that was 10 or 15 years ago. Today, slot constraints at many big popular airport hubs around the world mean that demand for big planes is rising again. In other words, the same reasons that are forcing Emirates to use enormous planes to keep up with demand are starting to hit other airlines, at least to some extent. So, if the A350-2000 goes ahead with a workable Rolls-Royce engine under its wing, it might be too small to qualify as even a partial A380 replacement for Emirates. However, it could of course still get orders from existing A350 operators who want a plane the size of the Boeing 777-9. This is a side of the aviation industry that is definitely worth watching over the next few months. Firstly, because Boeing, despite the almost comical delays of the 777X, could actually end up becoming the only manufacturer capable of making a plane that will keep Emirates happy. And at the same time, other airlines that struggle to find space in airports could shift at least some orders from the smaller A350 variants or the 787 to the bigger A350-1000 and maybe the 2000 or the 777-9 or 10. Ultimately, the Airbus A380 always remained a niche aircraft, suitable only for airlines operating under specific conditions. However, the much better economics of twin jets that make extensive use of composites or advanced alloys that have two ultra-modern turbofans under their wings could end up making the next generation of super jumbos a more common sight in our skies over the coming years. But do you think it's realistic? Do you agree that Boeing stands a better chance of giving Emirates what they need? Let me know in the comments below if there's a factor that we've missed that swings the balance in Airbus's favour. I'm Ben Watts, you're watching Mentor Now. Have an amazing week, and I'll see you next time.